Good afternoon on this Tuesday, December 3rd. I'm Yumna Naufal, and these are today's headlines. Tripoli is put under the army's control for 6 months in an attempt to end recurrent sectarian fighting in the city. At least 4 people are killed and 17 wounded in a suicide bomber in central Damascus, Syria. And the Ukrainian parliament rejects motion to hold confidence vote, fearing the out-of-control protests turn into a coup. The Lebanese army carried out raids in Tripoli one day after the country's top leaders authorized the military to take charge of security in Lebanon's second largest city for 6 months. Monday's decision was taken at a meeting between President Michel Sleiman, Army Chief General Jean Ahwajeh, and caretaker Prime Minister Najib Mikati. According to the decision, the army would also be in charge of carrying out arrests ordered by the judiciary. The first aspects of the agreement among the top officials was implemented on Tuesday morning. Heavy gunfire was heard in the city's internal markets between Bab al-Ramil and Al-Mulla Mosque after the army raided militant hideouts. Later, its command said in a communique that a military patrol arrested Ahmad Abdul Qadir al-Shami, who had pointed a gun at the driver of a military vehicle used for the evacuation of victims. Lebanese forces leader Samir Jaja says Hezbollah has revealed its true colors and is acting according to its own will, pointing out that the cabinet must be swiftly formed to end the paralysis in the country. Hezbollah has set its strategy and is bluntly contradicting the laws and constitution. This is what Jaja said via Skype during the Lebanese forces annual convention in Melbourne, Australia. He noted that the party doesn't want to cover or support any Lebanese side and will go on with what it believes despite different points of views. Hezbollah has dispatched fighters to battle alongside the Syrian regime against rebels seeking the overthrow of President Bashar al-Assad. The conflict pitting a Sunni-dominated rebel movement against Assad has raised sectarian tensions in Lebanon, and Lebanese Sunni fighters have also been killed while fighting alongside Syrian rebels. President Michel Sleiman held talks with UN Special Coordinator for Lebanon, Derek Plumley, and the head of the Special Tribunal for Lebanon, Judge David Barak-Waneth. Sleiman followed up with Plumley on previous resolutions over helping Lebanon cope with the Syrian refugee crisis situation. They discussed the implementation of decisions by the UN General Assembly's meeting in New York on September 25th, during which the international community pledged $74 million for Lebanon to support the growing refugee population. Sleiman also met with Barak-Waneth, who thanked Lebanon for supporting the International Tribunal. The national news agency is reporting that Mahmoud Abdul Hamid Isa and his companion were wounded in the blast that took place during the funeral of Mohammed al-Saadi in the Palestinian refugee camp of Ain al-Hilwe. LBC TV said that the youth who had planted the bomb was killed in the blast. Fatah leader Munir al-Maqda later said that a youth whose disfigured body was found at the scene likely planted the bomb. Moreover, he noted that the sides who killed Saadi were likely behind the explosion and that the Ain al-Hilwe blast is part of a series of attacks against the community. He noted that some sides want to break their unity and create tensions. Maqda warned that the necessary measures will be taken against whoever is found to be behind this attack. And senior customs officer Colonel Ibrahim Shamsuddin has been charged in the attack on Al Jadid TV crew members. Military prosecutor Sa'ad also filed charges against Colonel Shamsuddin and customs personnel Mohammed al-Saghir for using force and beating journalists who were conducting an investigation for a program about corruption on Al Jadid TV station. Video footage aired on Al Jadid television channel showed last week several customs agents beating up 4 journalists after one of them, Riyad Kubaisi, pushed for an interview with the head of the Customs General Directorate, Shafiq Mirhi, over alleged corruption. At least 4 people are killed and 17 wounded in a suicide bomber in central Damascus. The Syrian Observatory for Human Rights, a Britain-based monitoring group, said the target of the attack appeared to be a government building. Suicide bombers have repeatedly targeted the capital in the bloody 33-month conflict, pitting forces loyal to President Bashar al-Assad against rebels seeking his ouster. Islamist fighters who captured a Christian village north of Damascus have moved some nuns to a nearby town, but it was not clear if they had been kidnapped or evacuated for their safety, according to the Vatican's ambassador to Syria. The militants took the ancient quarter of Ma'lula on Monday after heavy fighting with President Bashar al-Assad's forces. Syrian state media said they were holding the nuns captive in the Greek Orthodox monastery of Mar Ta'la. Vatican envoy Mario Zinari said the 12 nuns had been taken from Ma'lula to Yabrud, about 20 kilometers to the north. Zinari said the Greek Orthodox Patriarchate had told him armed men had entered the monastery on Monday afternoon. The fighting, which pits Al-Qaeda-linked Nusra front fighters and other rebels against Assad's forces, is part of the wider struggle for control of the Damascus-Homs highway in central Syria. And 5 Arab countries are ranked among the top 10 most corrupt nations, according to Transparency International's newly released annual Corruption Perception Index. This comes as instability in the region has had profound effects on governance. The list ranks countries on an index score that relates to perceptions of the degrees of corruption as seen by country analysts and business people. Bottom 10 ranked nations include Syria, Iraq, Libya, Somalia, and Sudan, as their governments deal with massive instability. Meanwhile, the top 10 ranked nations included the Scandinavian countries, Switzerland, Singapore, and British Commonwealth nations, Canada, New Zealand, and Australia. According to Transparency International's press release, more than 2/3 of the 177 countries in the 2013 index are scoring below the average, which indicates that public institutions in particular require more openness and transparency in decision-making. Coming up next, Egyptian poet Ahmed Fouad Najm, renowned for his sharp tongue and sarcasm, loses his long battle with illness. Stay with us. Welcome back. Prominent Egyptian youth leader Ahmed Douma is arrested for participating in a protest. Egyptian authorities have widened their crackdown on protesters since interim President Adli Mansour passed a law on November 24th that bans all unauthorized demonstrations. An Egyptian judicial source said Douma was being questioned for participating in a violent protest outside a Cairo court on Saturday. The source said that the general prosecution is also investigating a separate complaint filed against Douma for allegedly insulting Army Chief General Abdel Fattah al-Sisi, who is seen as the real power behind the nation's interim rulers. In June, Douma was sentenced to 6 months in jail for insulting ousted President Mohamed Morsi during a television broadcast as a criminal and murderer. He was released 3 days after the army ousted Morsi. He is the 3rd pro-democracy activist to be arrested within a week. And still on Egypt, its beloved poet, Ahmed Fouad Najm, renowned for his sharp tongue and sarcasm, died earlier this morning in Cairo at the age of 84 after a long battle with illness. Najm's funeral ceremony will take place at medieval Cairo's historic mosque of Imam al-Hussein after noon prayers. Najm, who was known as the poet of the people, was one of Egypt's best colloquial Arabic poets and was known for his harsh criticism of successive regimes, including the post-president Hosni Mubarak. His fiery words expressed Egyptians and Arabs' anger towards milestone events such as the 1967 defeat against Israel and the 1979 peace treaty with Israel. His openly political works led to his imprisonment under the rule of generals Gamal Abdel Nasser and Anwar Sadat. Poems written by Najm have become an emblem of resistance and opposition. His poetry communicated both a love for his country and scathing criticism of its ills. At least 18 people are killed in attacks in Baghdad, Iraq, as well as all of the northern and western side. In the deadliest attack yet, twin roadside bombs exploded near municipal offices in Termiye, a town just north of Baghdad. When onlookers gathered at the scene, 2 suicide bombers blew themselves up. Violence elsewhere in Iraq left 11 people dead and many more wounded. The rise in violence has prompted the authorities to appeal for international help in combating militancy ahead of the April elections. Officials have blamed a resurgent al-Qaeda emboldened by the civil war raging in Syria. But the government has itself faced criticism for not doing enough to address the concerns of Iraq's disaffected Sunni Arab minority. Analysts say that while most Sunnis do not actively support al-Qaeda, a lack of faith in the government may persuade them to stop cooperating with authorities in their efforts to combat the jihadist network's Iraq affiliates. U.S. Secretary of State John Kerry leaves the United States for meetings in Belgium, Moldova, Israel, and the West Bank. Kerry's first stop is Brussels, Belgium, where he was expected to meet with Georgian Foreign Minister Maya Panjikidze. In Brussels, he also will attend a NATO meeting for foreign ministers, and he will make stops next in Chinaso, Moldova, to discuss bilateral issues and the country's path towards European integration, as well as in the Middle East to meet Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. Topics for discussion with the Israeli leader include ongoing negotiations between Israel and the Palestinians and a recent agreement to curb Iran's nuclear program. Kerry is scheduled to go on to Ramallah, West Bank, to meet Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas about the Middle East peace negotiations. He is set to return to Washington on December the 6th. Anti-government protesters in Thailand crossed heavily fortified barriers and reached the gates of the Prime Minister's office without resistance from the police. The surprise development eased the tensions in the Thai capital following 3 days of clashes between the security forces and demonstrators who seek to overthrow Thai Prime Minister Yingluck Shinawatra. Earlier today, police said they would no longer use force to defend their Bangkok headquarters from protesters. The prominent opposition leader, Suthep Thagosupan, however, said the recent development was not an overwhelming victory. Addressing the demonstrators by Government House, he added the job was not done until Shinawatra regime was overthrown. On her part, PM Shinawatra insisted that the government was no longer trying to pass the controversial bill that would have pardoned many people involved in corruption. And from protesting in Thailand, we move to Ukraine, where the parliament has rejected a motion to hold a vote of confidence in the government following massive pro-EU protests calling for the resignation of President Viktor Yanukovych and his government. According to reports, the debate inside the parliament broke into shouting and shoving between administration and opposition politicians. Outside, demonstrations continued and crowds blocked the main government buildings. Ukraine's Prime Minister Mykola Azarov warns that the anti-government demonstrations in the capital Kiev are becoming out of control and could turn into a coup. Azarov insisted Ukraine's authorities were ready for a dialogue with the protesters and promised that violence would not be used against peaceful demonstrators. As the protest rages, Yanukovych is set to travel to China, leaving the country plunged into crisis by his decision to spurn a landmark EU deal and boost ties with Ukraine's Soviet ally, Russia. U.S. President Barack Obama made a speech to mark World AIDS Acquired Immune Deficiency Day at the White House. Obama touted his work with his administration, and he said that he has done to help those living with HIV and also its prevention. The president said that last month he signed the HIV Organ Policy Equity Act to finally allow research into organ donations between people with HIV, adding that because of the Affordable Care Act, millions of insured Americans will be able to get tested free of charge. Philanthropist Bill Gates was among those who attended Obama's speech. HIV is one of the top priorities of the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation and many other organizations in the United States and around the world. According to the U.S. Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, just over 1 million people are living with HIV in the United States, while 1 in 5 are unaware of their infection. This marks the end of our bulletin for today. Now for a reminder of our headlines. Tripoli is put under the army's control for 6 months in an attempt to end recurrent sectarian fighting in the northern city. At least 4 people are killed and 17 wounded in a suicide bomber in central Damascus, Syria. And the Ukrainian parliament rejects motion to hold confidence vote, fearing the out-of-control protests turning into a coup. Those are your Tuesday headlines live on Future Television in Beirut. I'm Yumna Naufal wishing you a good night.